multiculturalism and status of women. So as you know, and why you're on the call today, of course, is we just recently announced our multiculturalism, inclusion, Indigenous and inclusion grant program. And so hopefully we'll be able to give you a little bit of information on the new program. And I'll probably talk for about half an hour, and then we'll leave space for people to ask questions. Here, what is the new grant program? So like I mentioned, this new grant program was announced on December 10th of 2019, so just very recently. And it's really about providing funding for projects that build intercultural awareness and inclusion of multicultural and Indigenous communities. And you'll see later we have two different streams. It is a $25,000 matching program, so that means the maximum you can ask the program for is $25,000, but you have to be able to show a match of that equal amount, either $25,000 or whatever that amount is that you ask of the program. And it is one grant per organization per year. So when we say per year, we mean the fiscal year for government, and that's the April 1st to March 31st is the fiscal year. So probably some of you also know that we have the Community Initiatives Program, which we have the CIP project-based funding. And so if you're wondering about whether you can apply for both of those, you can. So you are eligible to, if you are eligible, you can apply for both of those, but it would have to be for a different project. So you can have two applications in the same fiscal year, but for a different project. Okay, so I think in this part, we'll just talk a bit about MIIG itself. So we call the program MIIG for short because it is such a long name. So if I use MIIG, you'll know what I mean. The MIIG program is actually a revitalization, I guess you could call it, of the former anti-racism community grant program. So the anti-racism community grant program was a 2-year pilot program, and we've learned a lot from that particular program, and we've made changes, and we've actually broadened the scope a bit, and that's what this newly formed MIIG program is actually about. Is we still have components of, if you have projects that address racism or discrimination in your communities, that would still be considered under the MIIG program, but it's also much broader to include more opportunity for organizations to submit projects that do more around multiculturalism and inclusion and that sort of thing. So it is much broader scope than the former anti-racism program. I guess the difference, another difference between the two is the anti-racism community grant program used to have 4 intakes. So the new MIIG program will actually have 2 intakes. So the 2 intakes, we'll go into the intake dates and help clear that up a little bit because we do have the January intake too. But normally we would normally have 2 intakes for the MIIG program. Okay, so, oh, sorry, that's the slide that we just spoke to. So in the MIIG program itself, there are 4 outcomes, and you can see them up on the screen there. The first one is that Albertans have cross-cultural and/or intercultural understanding. The second one is Albertans are aware of the impacts of discrimination and work collectively to reduce barriers. So this is where some of the anti-racism efforts, those kinds of projects would fit. And the third one is diverse backgrounds are celebrated by Albertans, creating welcoming and inclusive communities. And the last one is Albertans feel their cultures and heritage are valued. So you can see how it's a bit broader scope. So there are more projects that could fit under this particular funding. So what's important to remember in this piece is to think about your project and what outcome it would speak to for the program. And if it speaks to one of these particular outcomes, then your project would fit under this program. Okay, so I mentioned there's 2 different funding streams. The first one is a fairly broad community stream, which is about multiculturalism and inclusion. And so this is where really it's about the support to organizations for the multiculturalism and inclusion type projects. So it's fairly broad. Most of the applications fit into this stream. We also have a second stream, which is the Indigenous funding stream. And it provides funding support to organizations that have projects or initiatives very specific to the Indigenous peoples and their culture. So two definite streams. Now for the funding streams, it was important to us to make sure we have the Indigenous stream as well, just to make sure that we acknowledge that historical, the impacts of colonization and so on to Indigenous people. So it was very important that we do have a second stream for Indigenous-based programs and initiatives. Okay, so resources. So on our website, we have quite a few resources. That'll be where you'll find the guidelines. So make sure you do take a look at the guidelines. It has all of the information that we're talking about today and a few other things in more detail. There's a great application assistance tool in there that will answer a lot of questions. It has definitions in there of some of the terms that we use in the application, just so it helps to clarify some of your questions. We have a lot of resources and links to other organizations. So if you're looking for partnerships, collaborations, that kind of thing, people that are doing similar work, you might want to take a look in there and do a bit of research and see who might be connected with the kind of work that you're doing or proposing in your projects. And contacts, links, so do take a look there. It is helpful. We have an application assistance tool and then the information sessions that we're doing. Like I mentioned, we did one on Tuesday, we have one today, and that will actually be all that we do prior to the January 7th intake, but we will do more prior to the other intakes that are coming. So the intakes that we're talking about, now normally we would have two, which would be March 1st and September 1st, but because our program was launched on December 10th, we're also having an intake on January 7th. So I know it's a really quick turnaround for groups, and of course it's over the holiday break, so these would be for projects that are really at a ready stage. So you've done a lot of work behind it already, you have partners in place, you really have a plan, and you're just looking for the funding to support it. So those types of projects, I would encourage you to apply for the January 7th, and you'll know in early spring, in April, whether your project has been approved for funding. So for those others that are sort of at the idea stage and there's still a bit of work to do around who are the partners, who's reasonable to work with and connect with, and you still have to get some quotes in line and different things, then I'd encourage you to apply for the March 1st deadline. So in any fiscal year, it will always be March 1st and September 1st for our intakes. January 7th, you won't see again. So that was just because of the announcement being in December. So those are the two intake dates. The next piece is really about eligibility. So can you apply to the MIIG program? So there's some very basic eligibility requirements for organizations. And this is very similar across most of our community grant programs. So we go through provincial legislation or federal legislation. Most of our groups that we see tend to be around the Societies Act of Alberta. So if you are registered through any one of these provincial or federal legislations, you would be eligible. Also any First Nations or Métis settlements, and universities, colleges, if you're registered under the Post-Secondary Learning Act. So that would be the eligibility that we look for off the top. Some of the, when we actually go through and review applications, these tend to be the organizations that typically get funding. So obviously the ones that best meet the guideline criteria. And then we're looking sort of to the under 500,000 organizations. And I know we've had a few questions about this, and it doesn't mean that you're not eligible if you're over 500,000. It just may mean that you're a lower priority, depending how many organizations we have apply. And it's, the next question is, well, how many organizations apply? And because it is a new program, we're kind of guessing as well how many applications we'll get in. So it's really tough to say. Overall, we're always oversubscribed for our programs, so you know that there will be more applications than there is funding, which, you're out there doing fantastic work in communities, and I wish that we had enough to fund everyone, but unfortunately we don't. So we're kind of looking at that under 500,000, but you're not out of the picture if you're over 500,000. It just means that depending if we get a lot of applications, you may be lower on the priority list. Applications that have not received prior Government of Alberta funding, or that you maybe receive ongoing operational government funding. So we look at that kind of thing, but again, it doesn't mean that you're not eligible, it just means that it might be a lower priority. Those that can demonstrate the involvement of partner organizations from other diverse communities in the project development, delivery, and follow-up. So this is really important for the MIIG program. We're really looking to see organizations working with other cultural groups, not just in delivering, but also in helping to plan and organize whatever the activity, initiative, or project is. So that's something that's really important in this particular grant. So some of these things are things that we're looking for that would help strengthen your application to the program. Now, the program itself has 3 different project types. So we'll go into those 3 different types. And the first one is around training and education. So this is where we're going to see projects that focus on workshops, roundtables, conferences. You can see the list there. And they're really about exactly what it says. So training and education. So are you helping to increase cultural awareness in your community? Are you helping people to better understand discrimination and ways that you can reduce discrimination and racism in communities? So that's where some of those types of projects will fall. The second type of project is around capacity building. So some of the things that we're looking for in capacity building will be helping people and other organizations to share promising practices, research, and information. So that helps to build their capacity to then be more inclusive, or hitting the various topics of the program itself. It'll be things like developing strategies to support multiculturalism, evaluating existing initiatives so that you're reducing some of those barriers in community, or barriers to participation in your programs, or barriers to participating in community in general. Engaging supporters, experts, elders, and partners in the project. So any of the capacity type work that builds either the community's capacity or other organizations' capacity, your own capacity to be more inclusive, to provide services and activities that are more inclusive. So that's capacity building piece. The third type of project is enhancing cultural awareness. So this is sort of the events piece of the MIIG program. Now it's events that are encouraging participation of diverse peoples and celebrating Indigenous and the multicultural fabric of Alberta. So when we look at this, we do also have the CIP project base that I mentioned before, and this particular funding stream does fund events as well. So there is a difference between the two. So when we're looking at events that are funded under the MIIG program, we're looking at events that do have more than one cultural group involved in that activity. That it's really about building greater understanding and awareness of multicultures, or of various cultures. So it's not just a celebration of one culture, and that would fit more specifically under the CIP project base. But in the MIIG program, we're really looking for a celebration of Indigenous and multicultural cultures within Alberta. So if that's a bit of how we distinguish the two. Okay, so now into the criteria piece. So when organizations submit applications to the MIIG program, we have a quite rigorous criteria that we go through to determine which projects would be recommended for funding. And the various pieces are here listed on your screen. The first one being the organization's capacity. So we look at your own capacity to deliver the project that you're proposing in your application. And in that, we look at things like your background and history. Does your purpose align with the work that you're proposing in your project? Does your organization have prior experience doing this kind of work? Are you fairly stable as an organization financially and through your human resources, and you have people that have the capacity to deliver the project? What else do we have in here? really that you do have that leadership and your board support for the project going ahead. So the second one is project viability and financial feasibility. So we look at pieces in here around your resources that you have to complete the project. So that includes matching resources. So I did mention before, it is a matching program. So whatever you're asking of the program, you have to be able to match that same amount in a variety of ways. So either through a cash contribution, donated labor, or donated materials and supplies. So the other pieces that we look at in project viability and financial feasibility is that you've really thought out the plan of this project, that you have clear timelines, that you've outlined the details and activities in the project, and that you're ready to implement those. Also that you've provided a detailed budget, and the budget tells the same story as your application does. So when you're saying that you're doing specific things in your project, your expenses should reflect that in your budget. Let's see. The next one is the project impacts. And this is a really important one. We do look at the impacts of your project and how it's going to show that, how you'll show that the work that you do through your project is having positive impacts in your community. So are you developing tools and resources as well that can be used by community? Are we building through the project cross-cultural awareness and intercultural interaction through collaborating with other groups? Are we actually reducing some of those barriers that we see in community? So that's sort of the impacts that we're looking at. So there is a section that we talk about what are the impacts of your project, and we're really speaking to the outcomes. What are you hoping to achieve by the project that you're putting forward? So if you can really tell us and explain to us how the project that you're proposing will have impacts in your community, that's what we're looking for in that particular section. So access as well is another area that we look at, and that's really about how do we reduce the barriers to participation. And this could be for children, youth, women, newcomers, Indigenous peoples, racialized groups, etc. So how are we looking at being more inclusive for all people in our community? And does your project, how are you working to do that through your project? And then also, I guess access to is about how we share that information learned through your project or whatever you're creating or developing in your project, and how do we share that out with other groups. The next one, I think that's good for access. That's pretty straightforward. And then community and regional need. So we're looking at, in this particular one, are you providing impact within your local region? Is it local, regional, or provincial? So what kind of reach or scope is your project focusing on? Do you have community support around a needs assessment? How did you determine that this is something that needed to be done? Did you do an assessment? Have you had interviews? Did you do focus groups? How do you know that the project that you're doing is needed in community? And then how are you working with others? Because if you can show us that there's other people, other organizations involved in the project, then that shows that they're also committed and they also see the need for that work in community. So do make sure, if you do have partners and supporters, that you send us letters from those groups, because that does strengthen your application for sure. And then we look at some other funding considerations. And there's a few different ones. We talked about some of those, about the budget being under $500,000. How you best meet the criteria. But we do look at other things like, are you ready to go? So if we gave you the funding tomorrow, would your project be ready to go? Could you start the project right away? So you do have, in the guidelines, we have 18 months from the time that you receive the funding if you're approved for your program. So you have 18 months to complete that. So within that 18 months, are you ready to go, and can you do the project within that time frame? What else do we look for? I guess some of the again, we've talked about most of this, the financial capacity to be able to do that. Do you have partners? And then it is always, like I mentioned before, the availability of the grant funds, because we do only have so much funding within the MIIG program and always a lot of applications. So it may be just simply the availability of funding that we have to look at. So those are some of the other funding considerations that we look at, but overall, we do a lot of assessment of your projects when they come in, and those are the general categories that we look at when we're assessing those. Okay, so what do I need to know about my project budget? You definitely need to submit one, first off. So do please include your budget along with how much you're requesting from the program. So as I mentioned, MIIG provides up to $25,000 for projects, and that's a matching. And the matching component here could be a cash contribution from your organization, in which case we'd have to see financials or bank statements, that sort of thing, to show us that you have, you know, the dollars in the bank that would be matching that amount. It could be through donated labor, and we do $20 an hour for unskilled labor, $35 an hour for skilled labor. And that's sort of a general idea. If you have a professional coming in at a different designation, then that's fine as well, as long as you have something to support that particular donation, either a quote from them or something that says that they're contributing their services in this amount of money, which is fine if you just give us a letter or an email, something like that. And donated material and services. So again, the donated items would have to have something to substantiate those costs that you put into your budget. So if you can give us a quote, a letter, something that has that amount on it. So the matching amount can actually be any of these things. So it can be all cash, all labor, all materials or services, or a combination of any of those. So whatever makes up that $25,000 or whatever you're asking for is eligible to be your matching piece, as long as they're all directly related to the project. Okay, so a few tips, I guess, to wrap things up here before we go to questions. And the first part is make sure you do read the program guidelines, because there's a lot of really good information in there. It'll help you determine first if you're eligible, and then what kind of projects the program is looking for. So the program has those 4 outcomes that we're hoping to achieve. So if your project aligns with one of those outcomes, you can feel pretty confident that you'd have a good alignment with the project and the program. So do go through those program guidelines. There's an application checklist right at the front of the application, so make sure you go through there too, because the number one reason that the applications come in is and they don't go forward is they're incomplete. So make sure you include all the documents, your budgets, your financial reports, anything that's in the checklist. Just make sure you go through that, because it really, you know, it reduces the amount of time that we have to go back and forth to get the information in, and we need to get it in time so that it can go out for review. So if you want to reduce, you know, the chances that you may not go forward, make sure you get all your documents in. And then do really look for those partnership opportunities and opportunities to collaborate with other organizations, because the real intent of this program is to get different cultures working together and creating more awareness, education, understanding, so we can reduce some of that discrimination and racism that we see in communities. So do spend some time to research partners, go, you know, connect with partners that you already have relationships built with, and talk about whether there's connections or there's synergies between the work that you're trying to do, because that's going to strengthen not just your project, but the outcomes of what you're hoping to achieve with your project. So the application checklist, I think this is duplication. Make sure you sign your grant agreement. So we do send you a couple of things ahead of time, just so it speeds up the process if you are approved for funding. One is that we get you to sign the grant agreement, and we also do a lot of the technical side of getting the electronic funds transfer set up. So electronic funds transfer is the way that the government of Alberta is going now as far as paying grants. So we're not going to be sending you a paper check. We'll be just doing the EFT, so it'll be transferred right into your bank account. So we ask for a lot of that documentation ahead of time, just so it makes it quicker in the back end. And like I mentioned, make sure you attach your budget and your financial statements. And those are a few tips. I hope that we'll move to questions now. So we'll open it up, and I think we'll stop recording now just so that we can have the question period.